One of the stories of my childhood was Hans Christian Andersen's The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf. It is the story of Inger, a cruel and selfish young girl who tortures insects, rejects those who love her, appreciates nothing, and pridefully gloats at others' misfortunes. Inger's mother fears her delinquent daughter will trample on her heart as she has trampled upon her mother's apron strings, and so Inger is sent to the service of a rich couple in the country. They treat her as their own and dress her in fine clothing. As Inger grows older, she grows also more beautiful, but no less cruel and selfish. One day, as Inger reluctantly goes homeward, carrying a gift of bread from her employers to visit her mother, she encounters a puddle. Not wanting to soil her shiny shoes, Inger throws the loaf into the mud as a stepping stone. This act apparently is the last straw for the universe, and Inger is magically frozen as a statue on the loaf, sinks into the kitchen of the marsh wife, who gives her as a gift to old Bogey's great-grandmother. For a lifetime, Inger stands frozen, anguished, alone in old Bogey's dark hall filled with tortured souls. She hears, over the years, parents telling her story to children as a warning. Once, she hears a child cry for her, and this act of empathy begins to work its way into Inger's hardened heart. Years later, she hears this same girl, now an old woman on her deathbed, pray mercy for Inger again. At this moment, heaven is moved to act on Inger's behalf, and she is transformed into a gray, voiceless bird. All through the winter, Inger, in bird form, collects crumbs to share with other birds, and when she has gathered crumbs enough to equal the bread she treated so carelessly, she is freed from the curse she caused. At that moment, she spreads her gray wings, which become white as she transforms into a tern, flies over the ocean, dives into the sea, emerges cleansed, and soars upward into the sun. Morbidly, I loved this story of Inger. I had a battered collection of Andersen's fairy tales, and I have memories that my mother read that story to me over and over again. When I called my mother to talk about the story recently, however, she did not remember the title, and she asked me to describe it to her. Her reaction was astonishing to me. My mother does not remember reading it to me. In fact, she has no recollection of the story at all. When I recounted it to her, she said, "What a terrible story! I wouldn't have read that to you. All children are selfish, and a story like that is too much for a young child to understand. Send a child to hell? That is too vicious, too cruel a punishment." I began to wonder then how I came to remember this story so clearly, as well as how I came to associate it so deeply with my mother. If she did not read it to me, how did that happen, and why? As I considered this, I realized that Inger's story closely aligns with another story that shaped me as a child, my mother's story. When I read The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf, I think my child mind, seeking meaning, must have held it like a mirror to reflect back the story of my mother. That story, a family story, I heard repeated many times as an explanation, as a testimony, as a relic of lives shaped by tragedy and inexplicable loss. It surfaced in conversations with my mother and grandmother, in saved newspaper clippings, in photographs, saved artifacts like an old hat, a coal company identification tag, and a miner's lunch pail. I learned it as a lesson in injustice, the uncertainty of daily life, the necessity to appreciate the people you love as often and as honestly as you can. This story etched my family, and in my mind is indelibly linked to the story of Inger. My mother was 9 when her father was one of 16 men killed in a coal mine explosion in Marion County, West Virginia. From that moment, her life was forever changed. Because of methane gas buildup in the mine, it was sealed for 6 months. During that time, my mother imagined her father, lost, immobile, waiting to be released. Even though she logically knew he could not be alive, confirmation of death did not concretize until the mine was unsealed and the bodies of the men were recovered. The story of my mother's fear and grief, her child mind imagining her father lost and frozen in the darkness of a sealed mine, is the same torture Inger suffered in the darkness of Old Bogey's Hall. Inger is also a symbol of childhood punishment that outweighs any crime. Inger may have been a cruel child, but she was still a child. And in my family's belief, undeserving of the punishment she was dealt, the same as the unexplained, undeserved loss my mother experienced in the sudden, inexplicable death of her father. I don't mean to say that my mother was a cruel child or that she and Inger are parallel figures in my mind. Instead, I see Inger as the fear my mother faced, as the unjust fate suffered by the men in the mine and their families, as the lack of acknowledgement my grandmother received as compensation in the form of a $300 check, as the resuming of mine operations as soon as possible after the tragedy occurred, only to lead to a similar tragedy 14 years later in which 78 families suffered the same loss. In my mind, the pieces fall together. Inger, the girl with no father present, my mother, a fatherless child at 9. The innocent child who wept for poor Inger who got a punishment worse than she deserved. My mother, the grown woman, aging, tells her story to her child, and I weep for her. Inger is injustice, the unexplainable receipt of more punishments than we deserve. And I am the child. I am the woman who weeps for her mother, for Inger, for punishments undeserved. I related these connections to my mother, who said, "My God, I warped you." But Mom, this is so much the opposite of what you did to me. In the retellings of your story, in my rereadings of the fairy tale, the merciful child became me. For my mother, these stories, this is what I know. Inasmuch as there is unexplained evil, there is also transformative redemption. When we offer ourselves in the service of others, we become what we are meant to be. The canary who sings in the coal-dusted darkness, lighting the way for the hard-working miner. The voiceless bird who goes through the winter, collecting crumbs to feed the hungry. And when she's gathered and given all the love she can, she plunges into the ocean and flings herself into the sun.